Hello, CSW members. Thank you for joining us for another webinar here with the Canadian Association of Social Workers. We're so happy to have you wherever you are, wherever you're at, for joining us today for an hour-long webinar. I am very excited for this webinar today. I think it is not only timely and very important, but an incredible opportunity for us to come together as a community and engage and use this opportunity to ask some really insightful and engaging questions of our webinar presenters. I want to first acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and that I am a guest here today, and I am so grateful to be a guest here today and to be able to welcome this presentation. A couple little housekeeping notes before we get into it. I'll try and go through these really quickly. If you're old to our platform, don't worry about listening to me for a couple seconds. If you're new, welcome. Your entire screen is customizable, so take a couple minutes and make sure it looks the best for your viewing needs. You can make us bigger, you can make the slides bigger. You can also make sure you access your certificate of attendance at the bottom on the little yellow widget after you've viewed 40 minutes of that. So that should be it. We're here for your Q&As if you need. Please use your question and answer comment box throughout the presentation to send us messages as they come to your head. We will compile that for a formal Q&A at the end of the presentation if we should have so much time. In terms of everything else, you can just let us know in the question and answer box and we'll be happy to answer your questions. So today, our webinar is titled Decolonizing Journeys. We are joined by the Center for Indigegogy out of Wilfrid Laurier University. Our two webinar presenters are absolutely incredible. I encourage you to check out their webinar, their bios and the presenter bio. And please, please, please make sure that you have some time at the end of the presentation to fill out the survey that we have. That provides really good insight for not only the CSW, but for our webinar presenters as well. So with all that being said, I would love to stop talking and pass it over to our incredible presenters. Thank you so, so, so much for being here with us, Kathy and Giselle. We're so excited to have you. Take it away.
Well, I'm Kathy Absalon, and my Anishinaabe name is Indigegogy. I'm from Flying Coast First Nation, which is up by Timmins and Chapleau, and I'm in Kitchener today. I teach at Laurier, and I am Anishinaabe Kwe I'm a member of the Martin clan and the Bear clan, and I'm happy to be here today with you. Giselle?
Hi, Ani Nagani Jos Ko Gijigo Kwe Indishnikas. My name is Giselle, and I'm from the Métis Nation from the Red River, although my ancestors traveled the globe to ensure my presence. So they actually traveled over from India and from Europe and from the Seychelles Islands over to Turtle Island to the Red River. So I'm really happy to be here. I also work at the Center for Indigegogy, and I'm an Indigenous PhD student in the Faculty of Social Work.
Oh, I guess I should say I'm the director of the Center for Indigegogy and an associate professor in the Indigenous field of study at Wilfrid Laurier University. We're an Indigenous-based MSW program, and the center we started 3 years ago. Before we begin our presentation, I lit my match, and I'm going to start a smudge, and we're going to start in the way we always start our work, in a good way. And I'm lighting sage so that we can clean our heart, our mind, our body, and our spirits to receive. And I'm going to smudge everybody virtually. And so everybody gets that good medicine, whoever's out there. I want to say welcome to the webinar. And I hope that we can inspire you today and that we can offer you some good food for your not only just your mind, but for your spirit and your heart and your wherever you are in terms of your practice. So I'm just lighting my smudge. And this smudge is to help clear the pathway. And it will help to clear the pathway in what we are here to share and what you are to receive. And everything that we hear, everything that we receive, what we share, it all happens for a reason. And so I want to say miigwech to creation. I want to say miigwech for this beautiful day. Timashoneskizis, Minwa, Nokomaskizis, Chimigwich Gagamakweo Gimijan, Menobo Marasuing, Chimigwich Numadok, Wadokwishin Gambishgad. We said thank you to Grandfather Sun, Grandmother Moon, to Mother Earth, to all our relatives for helping us today on this day of life. And I want to say miigwech to my colleague Giselle for the work that we do together in the center, and to Alexandra for the invitation to be here with you today. And with much gratitude, we have this opportunity to spend time with you. And we're going to start our webinar with a song. So Giselle and I have our drums heated up, and we're going to sing a song for you to invoke the spirit of the work that we do, and to acknowledge that just that we're all here, and hopefully because everybody's virtual, everybody's remote, that this webinar also brings you good medicine through the song, for your families, for you, throughout the isolation that we're all experiencing together. And we're experiencing it together, yet apart. And so the song hopefully will feed you in a good way, and will help you in a good way. And maybe what we'll sing is the Swirling Water song.
Great.
Okay. This is the Swirling Water song, and it's a song that emulates the water of a river, or the water where you come to a point where the water is swirling and it's rapids. And it's kind of like the time we're in on this life path journey. And it's a time when we have to work harder to maintain our balance. And so the song goes fast, and then it wraps up by going slow again. And in that slowing down, it gives us hope that when we do our work through the swirling waters, that we can make it to a place on the other side where we can have that calmness, and we can have that peace and that balance again. So we send this out to all of you as we are going through the swirling waters. We try to make miigwech. Okay, miigwech, Giselle. And that song was sent out there to all of you, and hopefully you're lifted your spirits. So on your screen, I imagine that you can see the title of our presentation today, Decolonizing Journeys. And Giselle and I are here to talk to you about what that means and the work that we're doing at the center, and, you know, to help you to see how decolonizing is connected to your practice. Right, Giselle?
Yes.
I'll just flip the screen there, and Giselle and I are both at different locations, so I'm going to verbally check in with you, and if there's anything that you want to chime in on, the doorway is wide open.
Great.
Just do that. Give me a flag, because I can see you. And so decolonization is a verb calling us to action. To respond to that call, we must understand decolonizing as a journey. And decolonizing is a word that's been written about, it's been talked about, and it's one word that means a whole bunch of things. And when people say I'm decolonizing, it could mean a lot of things. People could be interpreting that word in many, many different ways. And so we want to kind of unpack that a little bit for you in this webinar. And we want to show you how we're doing this at the Center for Indigegogy and the journey that is happening within the center. And we're going to take you through some of the things, some of the ideas, and maybe unpack some of that a little bit for you so that you can connect to decolonizing yourself as a practitioner and understand why this matters to you. We want to know that at the end of the webinar that you can see that connection and that you can see how this matters to you in your practice in relationship to Indigenous people, and also in relationship to yourself and the place that you occupy and the way in which you move forward in your practice as a social worker and also as a human being in creation. So we are part of the Center for Indigegogy, and there's a slide here, and I'm not somebody who tends to read. Do I need to read the slide?
No.
No? Okay.
No.
People can see it, right? And
yes.
So I prefer not to read what people already have the ability to do. So if you read the slide, I'm just going to say a few things to accompany it. Basically, Indigegogy is learning and teaching in an Indigenous way. It means using Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous scholarship, Indigenous worldviews, and learning in an Indigenous way. So for me, I'm Anishinaabe. It means I use Anishinaabe knowledge. I'm rooted in my Anishinaabe worldviews, my principles, my philosophies, my Anishinaabe upbringing, and I don't just leave it at the door in my practice and in my teaching. I bring it with me, and everything that I do is rooted in my Anishinaabe-ness. And so so Indigegogy means basically teaching and practicing from an Indigenous rooted worldview in an Indigenous way. And there's a word that we use for that in Anishinaabe. It's called Kina Anishinaabe Kandasawin. It means, learning Anishinaabe knowledge and learning that in an Indigenous way, which is why we started with the introducing ourselves. We opened with our smudge, said some prayers of gratitude, and then sang a song. And all of that is to honor the spirit of the knowledge and the spirit of the center and the spirit of the work that we're doing, and repositioning, Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous worldviews in our professional development and in our practice and our research and our teaching. Giselle, is there anything you would add?
No, I think just had you described it before as it's teaching in the ways of the people, in the ways of the people.
Okay, great. Am I allowed to take a sip of my tea?
You can take as many sips of your tea as you would like.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alexandra. I wasn't sure, like, because when I'm talking, I need to take a sip. So one of the biggest questions that people have, Giselle and I just put up a few bullets, is that what does it mean to decolonize? And I like to think about decolonizing in a way that helps people to understand it, not in a way that perpetuates jargon, even that perpetuating jargon. How we unpack, how we work toward understanding what we carry within our being, in our thoughts, in our values, and our principles, what we have internalized. So it's taking a hard look at the ideas and the values and the principles that we've internalized, that we carry within us. And then it takes a hard look at the policies and the procedures and organizational development, and how both those internalized notions and those externalized notions perpetuate and reflect all the various facets of colonialism. And decolonizing is all about understanding, building your understanding so that you can wake up, so that you can start to make conscious choices. And some of the scholars who have written about decolonizing say the first thing about decolonizing is acknowledging that colonialism is real, that colonization happened, that Indigenous people have and always been here, and that the history of colonialism and colonizing of the lands is a real history. And the ideologies of colonialism are also real. And the pillars of this Eurocentric based society are actual real pillars. And so acknowledging that is important. That's really one of the first steps of decolonizing. And that in that, decolonizing also means looking at layers. And we're going to show you, we'll show you a diagram later in the presentation that gives you a visual about how many layers there are and how many different tenets of colonialism exist. And, it's complex, and one layer is connected to the next. It's a whole system that our society is based on that has been happened on the backs and at the expense of Indigenous people's land, culture, our lives, our children. And so so acknowledging that colonization and ideas of colonialism have all of these manifestations. They have been enacted in many, many, many different ways. And I'm going to show you how social work is a culprit in that manifestation. And decolonizing is also about in understanding the structural and systemic manifestations. And what that means and why that's important is to help all of us see that, colonialism isn't about each person's individual personal merit and value and worth. Every human being has merit and value and worth because you're a human being, because you have a spirit, you have a heart, you have a mind, you have a body, and you're here, and you have a right to be here. And so do Indigenous people. The problem is that colonialism has adopted systems and structures that have continued to marginalize, annihilate, oppress, exterminate Indigenous peoples physically, economically, politically, socially, spiritually, and understanding how that happens is embedded in decolonizing. So hopefully you're starting to get to see that, decolonizing is not just, like Eve Tuck says, decolonizing is not just a metaphor, it's a journey, it's a process, and it can be overwhelming about what does this mean for me. And so how we approach it at the center is we help people unpack this in a methodical way. And it takes people over 8 modules. Is that right, Giselle? Yeah, yes. 8 modules of going through different aspects of learning. And it, for the people that have come through the center, they've been engaged in the certificate and all the modules over a year. Because once you learn a little bit and you start unpacking that and you start realizing and connecting the dots, it can feel pretty overwhelming to your life choices, your practice. It's like you start taking the blinders off and you start seeing things that maybe you didn't see before, and you start knowing things that maybe you didn't know before. And it can be quite an overwhelming process that naturally invokes shock. Like, I had no idea that, I've had people say to me, I had no idea that Indigenous people went to residential schools. And when I've done presentations at gatherings, how many of you have heard about a residential school? Only a few people put up their hands. You hope today it's more people putting up their hands and going, I have, but still there's people in this country that don't know anything about residential schools. And when I start telling them the story about my family and how my family was a product of the residential schools, and people are amazed, like they're shocked, not in an amazing good way, but they're shocked. So, cracking open that protective shell that colonialism has created in largely the population, schools of social work are culprits too, when students aren't exposed to authentic, accurate histories of how Canada is a culprit in colonization of the lands and the peoples, and the very dehumanizing ways that that's happened. So that can be shocking, and it can burst a little bit of a bubble, and people can be left feeling like, wow, I had no idea. And so unpacking that takes time. It's a journey. And it's always important to remember that we are all products of a colonized society. We are all perpetuating colonial practices and colonial policies unless we're consciously unpacking. If you're not unpacking, then you're probably perpetuating unknowingly, and until we start looking at how the systems and the structures are part of the problem, it's hard to unpack that. So put those 3 words there because they're pretty common: decolonization, decolonial, and anti-colonial. And they mean different things. Decolonization, it's about what I just talked about. It's about recognizing that colonization is real. It's connected to the lands. It's connected to the people who occupy the lands. It's connected to pushing those people out of the lands and off the lands so that, colonists could get at the mineral, the gold, the resources of the land. Today it might be the water is a natural resource. And so colonization has been about the land, and then the people on the land, we've been in the way of that. And decolonial is a stance we take. So it's hard to be anti-colonial and decolonial if you're not decolonizing. If you don't know what you're engaged in. So to be anti-colonial is to be able to look at something and to think about it and go, what is that perpetuating? How do we want to hold this meeting, for example? Do we want to uphold Robert's Rules of Orders and perpetuate the hierarchy? Or do we want to engage in more collaboration and foster equality and shared voices and draw from everybody's knowledge and experiences? With that awareness, that's an anti-colonial or decolonial approach. You can't begin to see that unless you're actually unpacking in your mind and unless you're decolonizing. So there's a bit of a difference there. And you need to be on a decolonizing journey to be able to approach your work, your teaching, your learning, your practice in a decolonial or in an anti-colonial stance.
And I think I would just add to that it's, it's not just an intellectual process. The journey is so rooted in spirit and emotion and our relationships. And I think a lot of people come in, and a lot of social workers come in, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who feel they've already known this work and know the history. And I felt like I came in knowing the history. And I knew so little as Kathy started to go through the process of understanding like the layers and layers and layers and years of policies and implementation that went on. And I think that's where the grieving comes in. And again, because we've all been colonized and we've mostly come through this, system of Canadian education system where it's not Canadian history because it's only showing one part of what the history of Canada is and not the colonial aspects of what Canada did in colonization.
It's an excellent point. Sorry, we just have one question. Are you able to explain anti-colonial again before we move on?
Anti-colonial is a stance. So anti-colonial, it's like if you want to counter colonialism, if you want to practice in a manner that does not perpetuate the hierarchies and the power imbalances and the divisions that colonialism creates, anti-colonialism is that stance. So you're looking at you're looking at your practice, you're looking at organizations, you're looking at policies with a lens that looks for how is this colonizing, how is this erasing, how is this exterminating people, how is this dehumanizing people, how is this perpetuating power imbalances. And then so you have that lens already and you're building that and you're nurturing that lens. So to take a stance against those, to do something different, to do something that restores relationships and connections in a human way is anti-colonial. It's much deeper than that, but I only have so much time here.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to acknowledge too, when we have the cultural, in the Decolonizing Education certificate and in the modules, the very first thing we do and how we started our session today was acknowledging that cultural history. Before colonization happened, there is, thousands and thousands and thousands of years of Indigenous cultural history on this land. We have here 500 some years of colonial history of European colonists coming to the shores of the eastern shores down the St. Lawrence River. Prior to that, we have thousands and thousands and thousands, we say since time immemorial, of cultural history, of Indigenous presence. So much so that our presence on this land is connected to our creation story. Our creation stories all across Turtle Island situate the Indigenous people as being placed on their part of Turtle Island, specifically, uniquely. And so we have this very strong cultural history. And then from 1492, we have a colonial history. And so decolonizing is also remembering and acknowledging the roots of who we are as Indigenous people is steeped in this cultural history. And I just want to acknowledge one of my mentors who keeps coming to me when I talk about these things, who helped me to develop this structural, very sound, critical, anti-colonial, decolonizing, anti-racism lens, is Dr. Laurie Gilchrist, who is such a strong, grounded Cree scholar when I worked with her back in the early 1990s, who helped me to understand my experiences in this structural way, and helped me to understand that we're all in this together, whether you're Indigenous or not. If you've been socialized in this country, if you've gone through this education system, we're all colonized, and we're all trying to reroot ourselves, whether it's our cultural history or understand the colonial history and how it impacts us today in how we engage in our practice and in our relationships. So this slide, it connects us to the, I need to put my glasses for this. It's very tiny. In terms of, we put the slide in here because of the social work, the profession of social work has, you know, there are 150 years of social, political, economic, and spiritual control that the profession of social work has had in the lives of Indigenous people. And that's hard to, sometimes people have a hard time accepting that. And that social work, as I said before, has been a culprit in perpetuating the policies of social control and removing Indigenous people from their lands and dividing Indigenous families and taking Indigenous children from the arms of their parents and their grandparents. And that our profession has been a big culprit in this, has been an arm of the colonial government in terms of being a social control agent. Social workers are known as social control agents, you know, child welfare, the penal system, the justice system. How many Indigenous women are in shelters or have been experienced violence, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the high rates of Indigenous people in addictions and mental health, and the high rates of family violence. And, you know, as the profession of social work, we are implicated as perpetuators of this colonial violence. And sometimes we stand up and we stand we stand tall for, you know, our profession. And as an educator, I've read a lot of admission statements where people want to come into this profession to help. And that's good. How you help, it's important to understand you have to decolonize your lens so that we can change these systems that are actually not working for Indigenous children. They're not working for Indigenous families. And these systems are part of the problem in a lot of the I don't like to say problems again, but in a lot of the challenges that Indigenous families are facing today, and women who are incarcerated or men who are incarcerated, like this system is a big culprit there. I have to put on my glasses to see what I said in those tiny circles. I think it just lays out the different ways and the layers of the way that colonial systems have impacted Indigenous people. So, for example, the fur trade played, even, you know, the Hudson's Bay Company has built its backs on Indigenous people in the fur trade. And the fur trade has had a huge impact on Indigenous women. And the connection between the fur trade and displacement of Indigenous women and the alarming rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country. So when we start to see the connection between the fur trade, for example, one tiny example is that, you know, prior to the fur trade and male dominance and patriarchy and male sexism that's embedded in the European value system, where the men are somehow at the head of the household, in Indigenous systems, it's the women that are at the center. And the women are the decision makers, whether it's the clan mothers or it's the women in the lodges and the grandmothers, but it was the women that are the life carriers. It's the women that stand up for life. It's in our hearts. We are right connected to where life comes from. And so we are the defenders of life. We are the warriors for life. And so in our knowledge systems, that's embedded in there. So the first system dismantled that and displaced Indigenous women because the trappers and the agents would not deal with women because of the sexism and the patriarchy they brought with them. So, that's just a tiny example, one tiny example. The Decolonizing Journeys starts to unpack some of that so people can begin to connect the dots. And then you can start to see the layers of how much got buried. It's like the big expose of colonialism and how it's impacted how we think, how we relate to Indigenous people, who we think we are, who you think we are, and how we've internalized all that. We start to unpack that in a very structural, systemic way. I think I talked about that already, but we talked about Canadian social work history, the role of the missionaries. So the missionaries were the judges. They were the judge, the lawyer, and the social worker, and the legal system. And the Indian agents played that role too. They were all powerful. And so there's a whole history and pathway to how, for example, the social welfare system, dependency didn't just happen. Indigenous people didn't just surrender our subsistence and our way of having a good life. That happened very methodically with, first of all, bringing hampers of sugar, white flour, salt and pepper, and dropping them on the doorsteps of people. Those hampers, those food baskets eventually changed to say what you might call what you go and take to the trading post, like some kind of a ticket that you take to the trading post, and the person at trading post then gives you your food hamper. That ticket eventually changed to a check, and then the history of social welfare slowly emerged and was imposed in Indigenous people's lives. And Indigenous people were kind of forced into that kind of dependency because while treaties were being negotiated, food and rations and provisions were being withheld, and Indigenous nations were starving. So then they were forced to accept those rations. Those are the kinds of things that you learn in the decolonizing education session. Do you want to speak to this, Giselle?
Yeah, I think the importance of understanding that we're all treaty people and that we all have a responsibility, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So in this module, and as we talk, Darren Thomas, who's Haudenosaunee from Six Nations, speaks a lot about the treaties that are still happening today and what's going on across the country. And talks about governance structures that used to exist and that are still existing today in communities that have been able to have that resurgence and reclaim and start to work within their own governance structures. I think it's a surprise to many people still to learn that they are a treaty person and that we're still in these treaty agreements, and that many of them haven't been settled, but that they're still in process, and that there were original agreements like the two-row wampum that we both had a responsibility for, both the settlers and the Indigenous.
Yeah, and that we're all like, everybody here that's on this webinar in Canada is in a treaty relationship. I am, as an Indigenous person, have my treaty card, and everybody else that's in relationship with me has the responsibility to know that which treaty area you're in. I'm treaty number 9. I'm from the Anishinaabe Nation. That's my treaty territory. And, but in that, it's this relationship. And, decolonizing enables, it equips our non-Indigenous settler allies to enact that treaty relationship in a respectful, authentic way that upholds the teachings embedded in the Two-World Wampum Belt and in those treaty agreements. We have, who does this one? Raven Sinclair.
I think you've talked to, sorry, Kathy. I think you've talked about a lot of this already. I recognize we probably only have about 10 minutes left. So you've talked a lot about policies that have happened.
I guess the one thing is that Raven Sinclair goes through this, like she's an amazing knowledge keeper around social control policies, and especially around the child welfare system and the foster care system. So Raven does a 2-day workshop for us on this. And then Bonnie Freeman does a 2-day session on anti-colonial resistance and healing. And Bonnie covers Indigenous social movements. And she talks about youth movements, women's movements, the whole history of social movements. And that is eye-opening for people that haven't seen that Indigenous people have been activists and have been in this anti-colonial resistance stance since contact, really.
Mm-hmm. And that's why the languages still exist, and the scrolls and the teachings and the language still exist because of that resistance.
This next slide, positionality and relationship with Indigenous people, is this the session that we have Tim do?
No, this is the one with Ben. And as we talk about, this is the way that we've kind of talked about our decolonizing journey. So in each of the modules, people are talking about where they're from, where their people come from, what their relationship to this land is, what their relationship is with Indigenous people. So people are doing that internal work all along. In each session, it's kind of starting to bring that out. And I think by this time, people are getting quite emotional. Certainly by Raven's module, people are starting to feel the grief that comes with recognizing how we've been colonized. Again, for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, the grief is very heavy to realize all the ways that we've internalized this and all the ways that we've participated in it or just haven't known about it. And so Ben's part of his is about he's had good relationships with Indigenous people for many, many years. For decades. And I think he comes in to kind of talk about how to be in good relationship with Indigenous people while knowing your center and knowing where you come from.
And I want to add too that in addition to the grief that emerges, the other thing that emerges is people get pissed off because you realize that in the education system, like people went through undergraduate degrees, whether it's in education or whether it's in social work, or they've gone to law school, or they've gone to do their psychology degree, or they've done all this stuff and they have PhDs and they're ignorant. Most people in this country are ignorant because ignorance prevails in a colonial society. It's like what Brazilian educator Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed talked about. If you keep the peasants ignorant and illiterate, they can't take their place in changing a corrupt, disempowering, dehumanizing system. It's the same thing in Canada. People have been kept ignorant. And so there's also this other thing that happens when people are decolonizing is they start to feel angry that they've been duped, that they haven't been taught accurate information so that they could take their good intentions to say, I want to be a good helper. I don't want to do harm. I want to be respectful. And if you don't have accurate information, it doesn't matter how good your intention is, you're going to perpetuate a system that has already caused so much harm. So one of the ways to do that is to unpack that. And so I find that grief and anger are two common things that happen. It happens with me all the time. I still get angry, and that propels me to continue to do our work. And in this positionality and in relationship with Indigenous peoples, I want to acknowledge Ben Carneal. Ben Carneal is the longstanding author of Case Critical, and Ben is a very strong structural thinker and knowledge carrier within the white settler society. And so we've been so fortunate to have Ben Carniel as one of our facilitators. We just have rock solid facilitators.
And I would just, with Ben as well, is what he offers is this opportunity to get people through fear. Because people carry a lot of fear. Like once they get the information, they're angry and people are grieving, including me. People have fear around, oh, how do we move forward? And what does that look like? And how do I get through, all the fears of misstepping and being called out and being called in, and what does that look like? And so he really helps guide and massage that process so people can articulate it and kind of come to the other side of it.
And this is the one that Tim LeDuc does. And Tim LeDuc is an interesting, he now teaches in the Faculty of Social Work at Laurier. And Tim LeDuc, Timothy LeDuc, capital L, small e, capital D-U-C, is a guy that describes himself as being on an island in between the big ship and the canoe. That's the true wampum. There's the big ship representing European values, and there's a little canoe that represents Indigenous peoples. And one isn't meant to overtake the other, but they're supposed to coexist, respecting each other's values. And Tim identifies that he's kind of on an island in between the big ship and the canoe, finding his way as in terms of his blend. And he has Mohawk ancestry, so he does a lot of work with the wampum belts as well. And Tim does a lot of work around race, power, and privilege in his sessions, and somebody who's kind of on that journey of finding their way, and he connects a lot to the land. He's done a lot of work around the relationship between environmental racism and the land-based, the ecology of the land and social work practice. I think that's our last session, is learning from the land, decolonizing and naturalizing relations. So we try to bring people to this journey. And I guess one of the things that I often talk about in the first session is, waking up from a colonial coma is not easy. It's like waking up from a coma, I'm sure, isn't easy. I've never been in a coma physically, but we have all been in a colonial coma. And when I started waking up and started looking at, who am I? Where do I come from? Why do people treat me the way they treat me? Why do people regard me the way they regard me, without understanding racism, without understanding the impact of racism, because I'm a racialized Indigenous woman? I never had the language to understand that. And I didn't really understand the structures. So I just thought I was doing my job by just, towing, being a good worker, being a good, whatever we're supposed to do, just following the rules. So, and carrying on. And so waking up from this coma, because the rules are steeped in colonialism, is not easy. And these are some of the things that waking up from this colonial coma entails. It's on the screen. I just love this quote from Michael Hart, and it's, I can't read it. My glasses are stuck in my head. I'll just leave them there. There. I can't read the quote because but Michael Hart wrote this article a while ago, and it's still so relevant in the questions that we as social workers need to continue to ask ourselves. Whether you're Indigenous or not, am I a modern day missionary? And missionaries were about conversion and to Christianity. However, the modern day missionary of social work has been about conversion into colonial and Euro-Western values. And we've seen a lot of that in child welfare through the assessments and the risk assessments and the values that are reflected in that. And to not problematize the ways that those assessments are being carried out and how they are being created is the problem. And so I think that's an ethical question that we can keep asking ourselves once we start engaging in our decolonizing journey, is asking ourselves, am I a modern day missionary, and how am I still doing that? It's a hard question to ask, but it's a necessary question given that social work has been an arm of colonialism on behalf of the government. This is from Indigenous Holistic Theory and Knowledge Set for Practice. This diagram is in one of the resources that we put at the end of our presentation, and you can go to that article. It's in this diagram is in this article that's titled Indigenous Holistic Theory and Knowledge Set for Practice in the First Peoples Child and Family Review Journal. And it was first published in 2010. I wrote the article, and I presented this knowledge set for practice with Indigenous people. And this whole knowledge set, it's a decolonizing knowledge set. And we give you the reference for this article at the end, and it was republished in 2019 in the journal. So that's why it's a journey. This doesn't just happen. Unpacking this lens, repacking it, it takes time. And for me, it's been a lifetime of growing and developing and learning and all of the emotions involved. And I'm still decolonizing. Giselle?
Yeah, and just to speak to that ongoing decolonizing, is that when you work in colonial institutions, it's a constant struggle because you get swept up in it. And then you wake up out of the colonial coma and realize again the ways that you've perpetuated or the ways that you haven't stood up for something that you believe in. And I think that part of this journey for me has always been about, the outcome has been about slowing down so as to not miss those. Like, I think we live in that kind of capitalist and colonial world where we're like on the go, and we don't have that time for self-reflection. And I think what participating in this has led me to do is for me to, one, be more gentle with myself, to be able to lift up my gifts and feel good about that, to know who I am, where I stand, and what my relationship is to other Indigenous people and to settlers as I live in both worlds. And I think it's empowered me to feel like I can wake up from that colonial coma and remember who I am and where I need to go. So we at the center, I just want to give you a little bit of a brief on what we do at the center, because we do offer holistic professional development. This is the Decolonizing Education Certificate is one program that we offer. We have a 4-day for understanding decolonization that's going to be happening in October, that people who might not be able to take off 2 days a month to join us on remote learning can take over the 4 days. And just to say that because of the circumstances right now, we've moved our programming online, which is not something that we had thought we would ever do, because we really wanted to find the ways of actually holding on to Indigegogy and the principles of Indigegogy that normally we felt we could only get in the classroom. But since running some of our courses online, we're starting to realize we can still hold the principles of Indigegogy, similar to how we open today with the song, smudge, and the prayer, and running in circle process. So we have an Indigenous research series if people are interested in learning more about Indigenous methodology and ethics and meaning making. And we've got an Indigenous People Certificate that's meant for Indigenous practitioners and educators who might want to kind of start building their own bundle and kind of learn about how to engage Indigegogy in their work. And finally, we also have customized workshops. So there's lots of people who are working for community agencies that are like, we need this very specific training. Can you offer that for us? And that is something that we have done and continue to do, is offer customized workshops for people. And on the next slide, there's our contact information, how you can get us on Facebook or Twitter or on our website. So I think that was our presentation for today, and we're open to any questions.
There's our resources that we encourage for further reading. Reading. I just happen to be somebody who writes a lot about this. I'm not self-promoting, but I just happen to be somebody who writes about this, and I've spent my lifetime working in this area.
She is not self-promoting at all, much to my dismay. I would love for her to be more self-promoting, so I have to do it for her. So when I came up with the resource list, this was part of me, because just as Laurie Gilchrist was Kathy's mentor, Kathy is my mentor. So I'm learning through that knowledge set and genealogy of knowledge. So I'm grateful. Miigwech, Kathy.
Yeah, miigwech, Laurie.
Well, miigwech to both of you. Thank you so much for such an incredible presentation. We have a million questions flowing in, so I'm going to try and consolidate them into some nice, tight, quick questions to ask of our two incredible presenters. Just quickly before we get into the Q&A section, if you do need to access your certificate of attendance, it's the yellow widget. Please, before you log off of this webinar, do the survey. It should be under the survey widget. I think it is also yellow, but it may not be. Please do the survey. That helps provide us with a lot of important details and feedback. I also wanted to mention that the resource section has the slide deck, if you are looking for that, as well as a link to the website for the Center for Indigegogy, as well as the CSW peer-to-peer support group, where we'll be posting some of this information as well if you wanted to access it on Facebook. So we'll go into the Q&A section of this little part of the webinar. One of the big questions that keeps coming in, and you touched on it a little bit at the end there, was, can people take your trainings, and how can they take your trainings right now?
Yeah, so our trainings are available. On the website, you'll have the dates of the new series coming up. So our Decolonizing Education one, specifically that Kathy and I have been talking about now, starts in September and goes all the way through June. So all of those dates are up on the website. And again, we will be offering this through remote learning. I think until we know what's happening with COVID and when we're allowed to be kind of back on campus, we will plan on doing it this way. And if we can go back on campus, maybe some people who are local will want to do that, and we'll have people still online. So all the dates are scheduled. There's eight modules. Again, there's a 4-day intensive that's happening in October for people who want to join us. And for that, Kathy will be one of the facilitators, Darren Thomas and Bonnie Freeman.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So make sure you
what I didn't mention is that we also have a holistic professional development that are specifically for practitioners, and we're just developing those workshops right now based on some of the recommendations that came out of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. So those should be up probably within the next 3 weeks.
And the other thing,
sorry, go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, I was just going to say that if anybody out there in webcam land has suggestions, then we are open to suggestions for holistic practice workshops. We don't replicate colonizing ways, just to know. But if there's a specific area, you might have an idea that might spark an interest for us of something we could explore more.
Amazing. I mean, for me personally, I didn't even know I needed this webinar as much as I did. So for all of those out there who are feeling the same thing, as knowing I needed it, but not knowing how close it felt like it hit, please make sure you check out more of their continuing resources. And we at the CSW will try and provide you everything that we can. I have a question, and maybe you can answer this, maybe you can't, but there's quite a few of the social workers here who are wondering what the best way is to work collaboratively with Indigenous organizations like yourself and or including elders in their practices, whether it be in child welfare or sexual assault clinics or anything. Can you give us a couple of maybe tips and tricks to engage Indigenous practices?
That's a great topic for a holistic practice series, because this comes up. And it's about, when you start decolonizing and you start thinking about how can I do this in a respectful way, how can I engage with communities, I always like to encourage people to build relationships with your local community, with your local territories, get to know the territories, get to know your treaty territory that you're in, the politics of the land. Are you in the Union of Ontario Indians territory? Are you in Anishinaabe Nation territory? Are you in, what treaty territory are you in? And what local organizations are in your territory? And begin building relationships with those with those organizations. And I think that's the very first place that you can begin. Get people onto your boards, get people who have solid, not just a token person. And that means somebody who's just going to take a bum in a seat where you can take a check mark a box off. Get somebody who has a voice, who knows and is invested in what you're doing in there, who can actually give you some direction and be willing to listen to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that completely. A couple of people cluing into the fact today we released my position paper on ending mandatory minimums for drug offenses and the indigenization of our Canada's prison system as coined by the correctional investigators. Can you speak a little bit or at all to Indigenous and your center's maybe approach to the justice system and potential reforms that we need?
Oh my God, you have the expert sitting right there. Giselle, this is
Do we?
Yes.
Yeah, most of my last 25 years has been spent on prisoners' rights and penal abolition. So focusing on ways of actually starting to eliminate punishment and carceral systems as a way of dealing with social issues. So I'm not sure the center has a position a decolonizing position. So what we know is prisons don't work. There's alternatives to prisons. Drug laws don't work. It's actually about criminalizing drug users versus looking at it as a health issue. Yes. So my personal position would be to abolish the prison industrial complex entirely, and probably to legalize drugs in a way that we can stop criminalizing Indigenous people for them. But also looking at building healthy relationships, healthy communities, building Indigenous self-determination and ways that people can come back to their identity and their culture and their practices in good ways.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that.
About that for 3 hours. So
that might be another webinar we do, actually.
If that answered the question, great. If not, then I'm happy to talk about it more.
Yeah, well, I think probably we should have another webinar or something where we go to get into it, because we did release our position paper today, which it seems a lot of our webinar presenters have clued into, where we call for the end of mandatory minimums. We also have called for the decriminalization of personal psychoactive substances at the CSW. So thank you for giving us your perspective on that, and I would definitely love to speak with you a little bit further on that. One of the key points, I think, of all of the questions that I have been asking really goes back to the center that everyone has a role to play in the decolonization of social work and of our systems. We all have. And by signing on to this webinar, thank you for taking this first step. This is just the beginning. We need to continue this practice as we go. So I'm going to try and end it on a note where, one, the CSW is beyond grateful to have you both, and thank you for your knowledge and expertise and wisdom. And we will take at the CSW what you have said to heart in everything that we're doing going forward. Can you give us a couple little tips and tricks that you say are maybe the most important things that we can leave social workers with as we go forward today?
I would say is to keep doing your work, to engage in sessions like this, to keep educating yourself, to figure out ways to bring Indigenous people authentically into how you change systems within your profession, within your organization. And maybe in the CASW, having a couple of Indigenous people on this board.
Yes.
So that informs ongoing professional development.
Thank you.
I would have said the same, people just need to be engaged in their own work, as uncomfortable it is. And yeah, I think it's just stay engaged. Yeah, I would agree completely. And this is, like I had said, the first conversation of hopefully many that we have in the realm of this decolonizing journey that we should all and must all be on, especially right now. So again, Miigwech, thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity for the CSW to join you, especially in your homes. And thank you to all of our attendees for letting us be in your homes or your offices or wherever you're at for an hour. We're so grateful as well to all of you
for attending and for providing such incredible insight and comments. We do read them all, and our webinar presenters get a copy. So we take everything you say to heart, and we appreciate it, and thank you for being here with us today. We have more continuing education opportunities coming up, so please keep in touch with us, and keep in touch with our webinar presenters, and please make sure, again, you fill out that survey. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us, and have a great day.
Thank you for inviting us. Take care.
Yeah.